On a sunny day, two people were walking down a busy street, chatting happily about something they both liked. Suddenly, they heard a strange sound behind them. Turning around, they saw a person wearing a paper bag over their head, trying to reach the girl while hiding something behind their back. The person's eyes, barely visible through the holes in the bag, looked very big, making them seem a bit strange. Then, he whispered the girl's name, Asajai. Surprised, the girl stopped and looked at the person. He seemed nervous but managed to speak to her. With a bit of a stutter, he held out a box with a ring inside, expressing his love. Before she could respond, something interrupted them. The guy walking with Ami suddenly screamed like a girl and grabbed onto her, yelling loudly. Everyone around turned to look at the commotion. The stranger in the paper bag tried to calm him down by waving his arms, but it only made things worse. Soon, both of them were shouting at each other, causing fear to spread among the people nearby. They all screamed and scattered in different directions. Even a dog that appeared out of nowhere started barking. The peaceful day on the quiet street turned into chaos. Eventually, the stranger with the paper bag ran away, and Ami and her companion decided to go to the nearest cafe to avoid attracting any more attention. After placing a small order, they began discussing what to do about the guy in the paper bag and whether they should go to the police. But Ami surprised her friend by saying she didn't want to report him. She believed he was just a shy person who didn't mean any harm. Her friend was shocked to hear this. To him, the stranger seemed dangerous, emitting a threatening vibe that made him uneasy. Recently, there had been reports of people going missing and feeling like they were being watched for a long time. He was worried about Umi's safety and felt it was important to share this news with her. But Umi wasn't interested. She quietly sipped her soda, unfazed by her friend's concerns. Umi's friend was convinced that the guy in the paper bag was the one behind the crimes, so he kept trying to persuade her. But Umi didn't see it that way. She thought the feeling of being watched could be a misunderstanding or just paranoia. She always tried to find excuses for people or understand their perspective, unlike her friend. He persisted, trying to reason with her. Whether it was a street performer, a confident girl, or anyone else, he saw danger everywhere for Umi. He even took her by the chin to make her listen, telling her she couldn't go through life being so trusting and reckless. She needed to be cautious and have some self-preservation instincts. After he let go, Umi rubbed her chin where it had turned red. She agreed to be more careful, wanting to protect herself from harm. With her agreement, they finished their order and went on with their day. As Umi walked home, she couldn't shake off the thoughts about self-preservation and the guy with the paper bag. Despite replaying the day's events in her mind, she didn't feel threatened by him. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her, accompanied by a shadow. Turning abruptly, she was startled by the person following her, who also seemed frightened with something hidden behind his head. The paper bag man started to make excuses for his behavior, but just like before, he stuttered nervously. Umi noticed the toy's ears he was holding behind his back and couldn't help but admire them. Gathering his courage, he offered the teddy bear to her and rambled about his love for her with a respectful bow. Looking at the adorable toy, Umi found it hard to believe that someone like him could pose any threat. Despite her feelings of warmth towards the paper bag man, Umi couldn't ignore her friend's advice. Breaking her promise would weigh heavily on her conscience. Unsure of what to do with the gift, she realized that simply saying, "Thank you," and accepting the bear might not be the wisest choice. Meanwhile, the paper bag man remained frozen in the same position, trembling visibly. His hands, holding the toy, betrayed his fear and embarrassment. Blushing and shivering, he seemed utterly ashamed. Still curious about why the paper bag guy wanted to give her a teddy bear, Umi shifted her gaze from the toy to the guy himself. Peering into the eye holes of his paper bag mask, she asked him directly, making him even more nervous. She could see him fidgeting and avoiding eye contact, but she didn't look away, waiting patiently for an answer. Summoning his courage, the paper bag guy explained that he thought the teddy bear was very cute and immediately thought it would make Asajai Umi smile. He was doing all this because he wanted to make the person he loved happy. His words surprised her, and though he was visibly nervous and struggled to express himself, she listened attentively. Not wanting to embarrass him further, Umi agreed with his statement. Suddenly, he spun around and tossed the teddy bear into the air, prompting Umi to catch it. Just then, a police officer approached her with a stranger who reported a suspicious man harassing her. but there was no one else around. It was as if the paper bag guy had vanished into thin air, leaving Umi alone with the teddy bear, a symbol of his love for her. After informing the policeman that she hadn't encountered any suspicious individuals, Umi was allowed to continue on her way. The day had been filled with strange occurrences, so upon entering her house, she let out a sigh of relief. Placing the toy bear on her bed, she felt like something was missing. Searching her room, she found a medium-sized bag, emptied the trash, and placed it over the toy's head. Luckily, it was paper, making it easy for her to create 2 eye holes. Recalling the paper bag guy's words about wanting to make her happy, she realized she hadn't even thanked him for his feelings or the gift. Sitting in her room, facing the teddy bear now wearing the paper bag, Umi smiled as she admired the plush toy. Yet, she couldn't shake off the curiosity about why he was carrying the package. Judging by how red his hands were when he confessed, she could only imagine the color of his face. Umi pondered whether the paper bag guy would appear in front of her again. From that moment on, the paper bag guy's confession seemed to be everywhere. He didn't even spare the tennis court, leaving an inscription on the ground for all to see. At the cafe where Umi often visited, she started receiving frequent gifts, all passed through the waiter from the paper bag guy. He seemed determined, even going as far as spreading a rug in the middle of the sidewalk with the bold inscription, "I like you," shocking everyone around. However, luck wasn't on his side this time. Umi's friend, who didn't trust the paper bag guy from their previous encounter, happened to be walking alongside her. Determined not to let him off the hook, he grabbed the paper bag guy and demanded he stop following her. Despite not knowing how Umi felt about him, or if he was a bad person, he felt compelled to confront him. With a stern expression, he pointed his finger at the paper bag guy and began speaking. Umi's friend confronted the paper bag guy, explaining that if he were a criminal targeting Umi, he would also conceal his identity with a bag over his head to get close to her. That way, no one would suspect anything, which was the logic he used to illustrate how dangerous the paper bag guy's actions were to her. Tightening his grip on the paper bag guy's hand, he emphasized once more that he should not approach her again. It seemed to be the first time the paper bag guy had considered the possibility that his actions might be causing trouble for Umi. The paper bag guy gathered up the rug he had tried to place on the ground with his confession and quietly replied that he understood. Without even asking Umi herself, he walked away from them in the opposite direction, leaving behind Umi's sad, pity-filled gaze. Some time passed since then, and now, sitting in the bustling dining hall where everyone was engrossed in conversation, Umi's friend inquired about the stranger. However, the paper bag guy hadn't shown himself in front of her again. Umi's friend grew increasingly worried about her, noticing her lack of attentiveness. Even now, in a crowded place, she managed to get coffee jelly on her face, which even stuck to her nose. Quickly picking up her glass of drink, she accidentally spilled the liquid over the lid cover top. Umi's friend found solace in the thought that the issue with the paper bag guy was resolved. Concerned about Umi's clumsiness, he took out a napkin from his pocket and started wiping her face and clothes stained by the spilled drink. Meanwhile, Umi realized she had forgotten her lipstick somewhere and stood up from the table. She also remembered she left her notebook for the next class in her locker, so she instructed her friend to go ahead to the auditorium and save her a seat. Although he offered to help, she declined, assuring him everything would be okay. With her bag slung over her shoulder, she left the cafeteria. Walking down the long hallway, Umi quickly arrived at the office, which housed a multitude of student lockers. Since the incident with the paper bag guy, guilt lingered within her. She hadn't considered his actions a nuisance, yet she remained silent. Surely, he wouldn't show up again. Opening her locker, she searched through her notebooks for the right paper but came up empty. Puzzled, she tried to recall when she last saw it here. Closing the locker, she stepped back, knowing she had a few spare notebooks, so it wasn't a serious problem. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the man approaching the corner. Accidentally colliding with him, all the books and notes flew out of his hands, scattering across the ground. Umi quickly apologized, but her surprise peaked when she noticed her signature on one of the notebooks the stranger hastily collected. Offering it to her with a friendly smile, he explained how he found it in one of his lectures and was about to return it. While Umi seemed to pay little attention to the incident, a strong wind suddenly tousled her hair, prompting a feeling of danger. Cautioned by his story, she lowered her gaze and apologized for not recognizing him. as she didn't recall using that notebook in class. Despite her usual understanding demeanor, his words didn't match her memories. Pretending to release the notebook out of shock, the stranger grabbed her hand as she tried to leave, his grip tightening painfully. He accused her of seeking attention by pretending to be unavailable, critiquing her interactions with other guys. Pulling out her stolen lipstick, he assumed she was trying to impress him. Although Umi initially didn't recognize it, she realized it was indeed hers. The guy was convinced she was afraid of being liked and was feigning ignorance. However, he considered her behavior excessive and decided to teach her a lesson. With each step, he drew closer, continuing to squeeze her hand until they reached the wall. Fear coursed through her, her pupils dilated, and her breath quickened, flooding her with adrenaline. At that moment, the paper bag guy appeared out of nowhere, disengaging their hands and stepping between them. Holding a beautiful bouquet behind his back, he scattered the petals across the corridor. The unsettling guy grew increasingly frustrated when he realized that a man with a paper bag on his head was blocking Umi's path. Oblivious to Umi's terror, he failed to consider her fear. However, the bouquet that the paper bag guy was holding behind his back caught Umi's attention, diverting her focus to him. Gratefully, she accepted the flowers and nestled her face into them, freeing her hands for him. The creepy guy became even more annoyed by the paper bag guy's interference. He felt constantly thwarted by him, even when he simply wanted to express his affection for Umi, whom he found cute and shy. The constant obstruction infuriated him. After listening to the creepy guy's complaints, the paper bag guy surprisingly agreed with him. He admitted that he saw Umi in a similar light, but he had never expressed his feelings to her. Umi had made it clear that she didn't want his advances, and he respected her wishes. In his view, it was wrong to pursue someone who didn't reciprocate feelings because the person they loved should only wish for their happiness. Umi was touched by his words, appreciating his willingness to come to her aid despite his shyness. Even now, he didn't hesitate to admit that he had been mistaken in his approach, acknowledging that he had unintentionally annoyed her. However, the creepy guy had no intention of listening. Suddenly, he grabbed the paper bag, determined to reveal the paper bag guy's identity. Frantically, the paper bag guy pleaded with him to come to his senses and let go, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The young man who had brought Umi's notebook was enraged and ready to defend her. He prepared his fists, intending to punch the creepy guy and put an end to his harassment. But the paper bag guy couldn't allow him to do that so easily. With all his strength, he pushed the young man away, managing to break free from the grip on his paper bag. Losing his balance, the creepy guy hit his head against the nearby wall, causing him to slump down, clutching the torn paper bag tightly in his fist. The paper bag guy cautiously approached him, poking his head with his finger. Seeing no movement, he withdrew his hands abruptly, stepping back in surprise. Turning to Umi, the paper bag guy, now without his bag on his head, reassured her that the stalker guy was fine, just unconscious. Umi, stunned by the transformation before her, couldn't believe her eyes. In front of her stood an ordinary-looking guy, quite handsome, which immediately caught her attention. She continued to stare at him silently, holding the bouquet of flowers in her hands as petals scattered across the corridor floor. Observing Umi's reaction, the paper bag guy suddenly realized that his field of vision had broadened, and he was starting to see better. Turning back to the stalker guy, who had removed his defenses, he noticed him crawling towards him on his knees. Politely, the paper bag guy asked the stalker to hand over his paper bag. As the stalker frantically tried to hide his face, Umi spoke to him, causing him to turn towards her. Umi expressed her gratitude to the paper bag guy for his help, reassuring him that she was only slightly hurt. Then, she gently suggested that he didn't need to cover his face with the bag. However, realizing he might have his reasons, she quickly amended her statement, saying it wasn't necessary. She took the opportunity to apologize for their encounter yesterday, twirling her head in embarrassment. For the paper bag guy, her words meant more than just an apology. They were significant and deeply appreciated. Moved by her words, he stood up from his knees and approached her. With one hand on the back of her head and the other on her arm, he pulled her into his arms. Umi's eyes widened in surprise, and she was left speechless by the sudden gesture. The paper bag guy understood why Umi had started avoiding eye contact with him, as he often did the same when feeling scared. His words resonated deeply with her, causing her to forget about the bouquet in her hand. which fell to the floor. Holding her tighter, he hoped Umi wasn't too frightened by the stalker guy's threats and expressed his genuine concern for her well-being. His actions would have melted any girl's heart, and Umi was no exception. Understanding his intentions, she snuggled up to him, nuzzling her nose into his sweatshirt. She confessed that she had been very scared, but thanks to him, she felt protected. Clutching onto his clothes, she admitted that she had always been slow to notice what was going on around her. When he looked at her, she smiled affectionately, appreciating his concern. Grateful to have someone like him in her life, who came to her aid when she needed help, she expressed her gratitude from the bottom of her heart. After Umi thanked the paper bag guy for coming to her rescue, his heart nearly jumped out of his chest. Releasing her from his embrace, he was captivated by her dazzling smile, causing him to tremble. He squinted from the brightness, swaying from side to side as he wiped his eyes. He remarked that her smile was like a sudden flood of bright light, almost blinding him. Umi tried to reassure him, knowing he was exaggerating, but her words only made his face turn red. Standing in front of her, he attempted to cover himself with his hand, feeling overwhelmed by the situation. All he wanted was to see Umi smile, but being alone with someone he cared about made him feel unbearably nervous. Filled with adrenaline, he even started banging his head against the wall at her screams, despite her protests that it wouldn't make his injuries any better. Just as evening descended, he gave himself one last bump, causing even Umi, who had to catch him, to become nervous. Eventually, the paper bag guy's vision blurred as he looked up at the bright moon surrounded by stars, and he passed out. The paper bag guy woke up to find himself on a bench in the schoolyard, a crumpled paper bag still on his head. Clutched in his arms was a note that Umi had written. It explained that she would inform her teacher about everything once the stalker who had stolen her things regained consciousness. She also assumed that he wouldn't want to be spotted by the guards, knowing he had run away from them before, so she mustered her strength and carried him to the bench. Leaving her contact information, she asked him to text her, but the note abruptly ended there. Reading the note several times, the paper bag guy had something to occupy his mind about today. The next day, Umi found herself engulfed in a hug from her friend, who tearfully apologized for what happened yesterday, feeling guilty for not accompanying her. Umi comforted him and sat him down on a nearby bench. She assured him that she was safe thanks to the paper bag guy, having only suffered a minor arm sprain. However, her friend, Tomo, saw a problem. He explained that the two stalkers had clashed in the hallway, sparking a fight. It was all too complicated for him to process, but he finally seemed to acknowledge that he had misjudged the paper bag guy. He wasn't sure if he could be friends with him, but he admitted that if they talked more, he might change his mind. Nevertheless, he remained suspicious, especially after Umi had given him her contact information. Grabbing her shoulders, Tomo shook her in different directions, trying to pry out what the paper bag guy had written to her. He was convinced that the paper bag guy had been bombarding her phone with strange messages, keeping her awake. However, to their surprise, it turned out to be the opposite. No one had texted her or tried to contact her at all. Seeing how upset Umi looked, Tomo responded by acknowledging that they didn't know much about the paper bag guy, suggesting that perhaps he didn't have a phone or was simply afraid to use it. Reflecting on the paper bag guy's behavior, Tomo proposed a theory, which they decided to test on the spot. Pointing his finger towards a nearby tree, Tomo suggested that the paper bag guy might be hiding behind one of them. He instructed Umi to call out to him, predicting that he would jump out lightning fast and rush over to her. With a drop of his hand, Tomo got up from the bench and approached the trees. After carefully inspecting each one, he returned to the bench, relieved to find no sign of the paper bag guy. With a sigh of relief, he concluded that it was just a theory. As Tomo prepared to comfort Umi, he placed his hand on her shoulder. But before he could say anything, Umi called out paper bag guy aloud, and in a flash, he emerged from behind the tree. Tomo was furious to see him there, grabbing him by the collar and demanding to know why he hadn't written or contacted Umi, causing her worry. Grasping him firmly by the scruff of his neck, Tomo tried to bring him closer to Umi, but the paper bag guy resisted, pleading for him to stop. Even though he still had the bag on his head, he instinctively covered his face with his hand as he spoke. Shyly, he explained that his presence seemed to bring trouble for Umi, causing her distress. Umi was taken aback by his statement, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. Tomo realized that this was exactly what he had once warned the paper bag guy about. He never imagined that he would continue to follow his orders, even after Umi had willingly left him. Realizing his mistake, Tomo released the paper bag guy's hood, though he still seemed wary. Uncertain of what to say to someone like him, Tomo offered a sincere apology. With a respectful bow, he expressed gratitude to the paper bag guy for protecting Umi. He also apologized for his earlier judgments and admitted his mistake in labeling him as a troublemaker. Umi was relieved to see them finally getting along, deciding not to intervene. Tomo offered to buy the paper bag guy a drink as a token of gratitude, slinging his bag over his shoulder. Before leaving, he looked the paper bag guy in the eye, his expression serious as he warned him that if anything happened to Umi, he would hold him personally responsible. As Tomo walked away alone, leaving the paper bag guy feeling even more nervous than before. As Umi scooted over to make room for him on the bench, she gave the paper bag guy a welcoming look, inviting him to sit down. Accepting her invitation, he settled next to her, but an awkward silence filled the air. Umi began to look around, avoiding eye contact to spare him any discomfort, while he observed her behavior. After a while, he realized it was inappropriate to stare and turned his gaze to the buildings around them. However, the weight of the silence pressed heavily upon her ears, prompting her to break it. But the moment she uttered the first word, the paper bag guy jumped in fear, his heart racing against his rib cage. He instinctively placed his hand over his chest, trying to calm himself down and listen to Umi's words. Umi wanted to address the incident from the other day, reminiscing about the stalker, but the paper bag guy waved his arms, signaling her to stop. He explained that his presence in the hallway was purely coincidental. He had been wandering around the school when he stumbled upon her being harassed. Acting instinctively, he rushed to her defense without considering the consequences, leading to the events she already knew about. The paper bag guy clarified that he hadn't intentionally tried to follow her, and was seeking her out only to apologize for the trouble he had caused. As Umi paused, contemplating her next words, the paper bag guy looked at her, trying to gauge her reaction. Despite the tension, she expressed her desire to be friends with him openly. However, the paper bag guy was taken aback by her suggestion. He scratched the back of his head, pondering his response. Eventually, he shook his head, declining her offer. He had other plans for Umi, plans she hadn't considered. Assuming his reaction stemmed from her perceived lack of character or something special, Umi wasn't too surprised. Even Tomo had criticized her for being too soft, but she remained unfazed by others' opinions. Leaning her hands on her knees, Umi finally decided to explain why she didn't care for his answer. Squinting her eyes, she looked at him intently and expressed her desire to know more about the paper bag guy. His heart raced uncomfortably at her words, sending a wave of goosebumps across his skin. Gathering his wits, he tried to steady himself and refute his earlier statement. Placing his palm on her hand, the paper bag guy assured her that her temper had nothing to do with his decision. In fact, he believed that Asagi Umi was the sweetest and kindest girl, incapable of hurting anyone. Listening to his words, Umi felt awkward, unsure of how to respond. The silence between them grew, accompanied by awkward glances. Before they could continue their conversation, a familiar voice interrupted them. Tomo's head suddenly appeared between their faces, inquiring about what they were up to. He picked up the paper bag guy, seemingly ready to intervene, but Umi stopped him, refusing to let him interfere. Tomo was visibly displeased with having to let the paper bag guy go, but he couldn't defy Umi's wishes. Once again, Umi extended an offer for the paper bag guy to contact her using the number she had given earlier. Pointing to her phone, she assured him that she would eagerly await his message, to which he agreed. After finishing their drinks, the three went their separate ways. As evening fell, Umi found herself sitting at her laptop, lost in music and browsing the internet. She spent her free time eagerly awaiting a message from the paper bag guy, wondering if he would reach out. Just as she was engrossed in her online activities, a message arrived on her phone. Quickly removing her earbuds, she unlocked her phone and made her way over to the bed, where she sat down and stared at the screen. The messages were indeed from the paper bag guy, asking about her interests. Umi replied that she liked miso soup. After exchanging a few messages, she noticed a picture of a dog he had sent and wondered if he liked dogs as well. It had been a week since Umi started texting with the paper bag guy. Since she hadn't had a chance to properly thank him for saving her, she decided to invite him to meet up. He was quite surprised by the offer, and his delay in replying indicated his hesitation. Eventually, he gathered his courage and responded, suggesting that he choose the meeting place. Following his proposal, there were numerous suggestions about appropriate clothing and footwear, as well as the importance of using sunscreen. It seemed like he preferred an outdoor setting, but the suggested attire hinted more at wilderness survival than a casual outing. However, Umi was always intrigued by new experiences, so she quickly agreed to all of his terms. After confirming the time, she placed her phone on the nightstand and settled into bed. Umi had only met the paper bag guy at university, which made her curious about how he dressed in everyday life. She wondered if he had a collection of different styles of paper bags, perhaps choosing a white business-like one, a versatile plaid design, or even opting for a strange mask altogether. Lost in thoughts about his style, she eventually drifted off into sleep. The next morning, Umi gathered her essentials and made her way to the station. As she approached, she checked her phone and read a message from the paper bag guy saying he was already there. However, as she neared, she noticed anxious whispers among the people discussing someone. Sure enough, it was the paper bag guy, but contrary to her fantasies, he was wearing his normal clothes with a beekeeper mask on his head. He seemed preoccupied, scanning the crowd for Umi, and when she called out to him, he jumped up in surprise, startling the person sitting next to him. After exchanging greetings, Umi commented on his unusual attire, to which he responded that it was the most appropriate for their outing. He seemed concerned about the reactions of people around him, asking Umi if he really looked that strange. Paper bag guy usually carried a plain paper bag with him, but now he wore a protective mask. After examining him, Umi concluded that there was nothing strange about it. In fact, it seemed more natural than his usual style. Umi didn't mince her words and expressed whatever came into her head, which seemed to calm paper bag guy down a bit. As expected, they arrived in a village at a huge farm, with fields filled with various vegetables stretching out before them. It was an astonishing sight in terms of volume and diversity. For some reason, paper bag guy thought this was the perfect place for their meeting, choosing a more creative location compared to other options. Umi playfully addressed him as Sunvisor Guy, a nickname that he found hard to agree to, preferring to be called by his usual name. With puppy dog eyes, she asked him to explain more about his plan. He tried to convey that they could pick their own vegetables and then, at noon, try them instead of having lunch. Additionally, they could take some produce home, and the vegetables could be used as ingredients for miso soup. He also mentioned the opportunity to learn more about the vegetables, as there were so many varieties available. Despite her initial hesitation, Umi was actually excited about the idea, although she expressed her emotions sparingly. As they explored the farm, an old man who unexpectedly crept up also expressed his belief that it was the best place for a date. He turned out to be the owner of the plantation and felt a bit awkward when his vegetables were praised. Seeing the sun beating down, paper bag guy rummaged through his bag and found a straw hat that could provide shelter from the hot sun for Umi. Despite her uncertainty about wearing it, she put it on her head. Her cute look struck paper bag guy's heart, causing him to react as if he was experiencing a heart attack, clutching his t-shirt in disbelief. Although the hat kept her cooler to him, her glow was so strong that no sun visor would be able to block it out. Once they were ready, the farm owner led the way, not letting paper bag guy even sway on the ground as he enjoyed Umi's beauty. Despite their attire being perfect for sun protection, the heat was intense. However, the cool feeling from the cold packets inside their fabric made them comfortable as they relentlessly continued to work. When they managed to dig up some of their first root vegetables, their eyes shone with happiness. Despite the dirty surroundings, they truly enjoyed foraging for their own produce. Thanks to their hobby, time passed quickly, and soon Grandpa came to call his guests for lunch. As they put the groceries in the basket, they also decided to pick up some tools so that no one would accidentally bump into them. Paper bag guy managed to grab everything himself, but Umi, being honest and virtuous, offered to take half of it to ease his burden. He couldn't refuse her kindness, and kindly gave her part of the shovel. However, Umi was not referring to the division of the tool, but rather expressing her desire to share the load. Despite her protests, he insisted on carrying the heavier items himself, explaining that he only wanted to do nice things for her. Paper Bag Guy wished to handle the hassle himself and quickly ran up to the old man, who pointed out where to take them. Mummy wasn't even allowed to take the bowls to the sink, let alone the boxes filled with vegetables. Nevertheless, she couldn't afford to have all the dirty work done for her, as it would make her feel guilty for being lazy. The old man decided not to stand aside either and walked over to Paper Bag Guy, who was washing the tools from the dirt. His sudden appearance gave Paper Bag Guy quite a scare, but the old man advised him to let Mummy help with the chores since she was also interested. While she was talking to the old man's wife, Paper Bag Guy confessed that he wanted Mummy to just have fun on this day and remember only the beautiful things. Besides, that wasn't the only thing he wanted today. Scratching his cheek and feeling a little embarrassed, he admitted that he also wanted to look at least a little cool in her eyes. That's when the old man realized the beauty of youth and recognized that knights in this century are not extinct yet. At that moment, Mummy, who had been looking for him for some time, approached, searching for Paper Bag Guy. Mummy noticed how dirty and wet Paper Bag Guy's clothes were. Sitting down near the faucet, she realized that, unlike him, she was still quite clean. Seeing him work so hard, Mummy snatched the remains of the tools from his hands and started washing them herself. Of course, Paper Bag Guy immediately tried to take them back, worried she would get dirty. But Mummy was stubborn. Abruptly turning around to face him, she called out his nickname cutely, causing him to instantly pull away and freeze. Watching Mummy sulk, he couldn't help but think she was infinitely cute. When she smiled, he felt like he froze because she looked twice as adorable. Even though the work was tedious and hard, she was still having fun on the farm. As she tried to rinse the tools, Mummy brought them to the faucet and inadvertently made the pressure stronger than necessary, accidentally dousing herself from head to toe. Mummy, still soaked from the accidental dousing, laughed out loud and remarked that they looked perfect together like that. Surprised by her words, Paper Bag Guy didn't reject them, as he felt there was truth in what she said, a sentiment he shared. The elderly couple, observing them ended their youth and saw in them a reflection of their own past. With their tasks completed, they bid farewell to the plantation owners and gathered their belongings along with the products they had gathered themselves. Paper Bag Guy had accurately timed their departure, and as soon as they reached the train station, a train pulled up. The carriage was half empty, ensuring their belongings wouldn't disturb anyone, and they wouldn't attract unnecessary attention. Today, they had collected enough vegetables to make miso soup. Mummy eagerly anticipated enjoying her favorite dish at home, but the journey seemed to be taking too long. Paper Bag Guy remembered her fondness for miso soup and attempted to strike up a conversation, but Mummy was lost in her own thoughts, only offering mumbled responses. Mummy's body was exhausted, and her eyes gradually closed as sleep overtook her. Paper Bag Guy, equally fatigued, soon followed suit, his body succumbing to the weariness. As they drifted off, their heads inadvertently leaned against each other, finding support in the unexpected intimacy. In this position, they slept for a portion of the journey to the next station, their heads resting against each other. Upon awakening, Mummy found herself leaning against something soft. She attempted to move away from Paper Bag Guy's shoulder, apologizing for inadvertently leaning on him, but he remained asleep and shifted to her side by inertia. This allowed her a glimpse under his mask, revealing a pleasant visage that left her puzzled as to why he concealed his face. Eventually, she stopped scrutinizing him and shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling stiffness in her legs. Unable to find an opportune moment to wake him and sit upright, Mummy resigned herself to remaining where she was, gazing out of the window. She touched her nose and winced, realizing that despite the hat, she had been sunburned. Nonetheless, they continued their journey, enjoying the passing scenery through the windows. After their busy trip where Mummy had taken on the role of a farmer, some time had passed, leaving them with plenty of leftover groceries. While she could have simply eaten the vegetables with ketchup, she stood there contemplating cooking. Remembering how the Paper Bag Guy was scared of bugs, apologized for leaning on him in the wagon, and insisted on carrying heavy things, a smile crept onto her face. Going on the trip was still a great decision, but now they needed to focus on cooking. Luckily, there were milk, eggs, and even frozen pie dough in the fridge, so there were no issues with ingredients. She spent half a day rolling out the dough and making a potato pie with bacon. It turned out wonderfully, and Mummy wrapped it in food wrap and brought it to her friends' classes. Sure, It wasn't perfect, and maybe the potatoes were a bit chunky, but it didn't spoil the overall flavor. Tomo was pleasantly surprised when Umi brought out the pie, and he continued to praise it, noting that the wrapping paper added a certain charm. With the amount she brought, there was enough food for everyone to realize that Umi had a hidden talent. As she had anticipated, the potatoes looked like they had been cut in one swift motion, but the pie was still delicious. Her friends enjoyed it so much that most of them reached for seconds. Umi didn't have time to talk and chew, so she gestured for them to take as much as they wanted and leave at least one slice. That's how they spent their lunch break, chatting about cooking. Once they finished cleaning up, they scattered around the building to their respective classes, leaving Umi alone. However, this turned out to be to her advantage. Stopping in the hallway at the vending machine, she took out her phone and began composing messages while selecting drinks. Luckily, she received a quick reply, so Umi read it and discovered that the paper bag guy was nearby. Grabbing a few bottles, she headed out into the courtyard to find a meeting spot. She wasn't in a rush to get there, but surprisingly, she arrived sooner than expected. No matter how much Umi looked around, she couldn't spot anyone nearby. Only the quiet rustling of bushes caught her attention. Carefully scanning the surroundings to ensure she was alone, Umi began to slowly part the green branches. To her immense surprise, she discovered that all the commotion was caused by the paper bag guy, dressed in a Hawaiian shirt with flowers draped around his neck. He was meticulously arranging lounge chairs under large beach umbrellas, creating a special relaxation area for Umi with the slogan, "Have fun even on a hot day." The idea seemed wonderful to her, and she immediately emerged from the bushes to praise the paper bag guy for his thoughtful creation. However, he modestly denied it, insisting that it was nothing special. Umi settled into the chair under the umbrella, while the paper bag guy grabbed a flaming stick and began performing a fire dance for her. Despite her willingness to help him instead of resting, he assured her that nothing was required of her today. Besides, the fact that she had brought a pie made from the vegetables they had recently harvested was more than enough for him, and he simply wanted to give her a treat. Upon hearing this, the paper bag guy paused in his dance, still holding the fire above his head. The idea of a home-cooked meal from his beloved seemed like an impossible dream he couldn't even fathom. Lost in thought, he stepped aside to put down the burning sticks, contemplating whether he was worthy of such a gesture from Umi. Besides the pie, she had even brought water, albeit with a peculiar peach flavor. Realizing the peculiar additive in the drink, he immediately turned around at her call and stared at the bottle with the pink label. Anyone could have guessed he didn't like it, so Umi grabbed her bag, ready to buy another drink. However, the paper bag guy didn't want to inconvenience her with his taste and asked her to stay. For a few seconds, Umi hesitated, remembering the other bottle she had opened earlier. For the paper bag guy to accept her drink would be like a gift from heaven, but it felt too awkward for him to do so. To Umi, handing over the tea was a small matter, but he continued to wave his hands in refusal. Just then, Umi raised the drink above her head, and he began to follow her movements. She moved the bottle around, but the paper bag guy kept his eyes fixed on her, still refusing the offer when she tried to offer him the tea again. This time, she reached forward for both bottles, but her hands seemed to betray her, reaching for the tea on their own. Despite his internal struggle, he simply stepped aside. Of course, he had his own reasons for wanting to drink the tea she had sipped, but his pride prevented him from doing so. This left Umi confused, though she knew one thing for certain. The paper bag guy didn't like the peach-flavored drink. She also found it peculiar and too unfamiliar in taste, but she decided to sacrifice her own preference and opened the bottle. Drinking some of the liquid in front of him, she emptied the bottle halfway. Now with two open drinks to choose from, she poked at his tea, deciding to keep the peach flavor for herself since she had bought them herself, unaware that they both disliked peach. Eventually, both bottles touched her lips, and she decided it would be best if the paper bag guy took her favorite flavor. Feeling the weight of the bottle in his hands, it seemed to him that the pressure that had been building up in his soul for months would explode like a volcano, spewing lava onto the ground. At that moment, he remembered the pie Umi had kindly brought him. However, he decided to change the subject, trying to keep the bottle out of sight and resisting the urge to drink from it. Delving into her bag, she pulled out a wrap tray with a piece of potato pie that looked incredibly delicious. Naturally, she watched the paper bag guy's behavior with interest as he hesitated, shaking from side to side as he contemplated how to eat it. Eating through the paper bag proved to be extremely difficult, necessitating him to lift the bag from his head. Unfortunately, he only brought it down to his eyes, revealing a glimpse of his mouth happily devouring the pie. Ami watched him closely, attempting to catch a glimpse of her secret friend's face, but it was challenging due to the paper bag obscuring his features. Noticing her gaze, the paper bag guy suddenly choked, attempting to cough up the piece that was stuck in his throat. In an attempt to help him in any way, Ami mischievously held out the tea, which he eagerly began to sip, forgetting that he had no intention of touching it. Only after he drank the drink did he realize what he had done. However, thanks to this little prank, the coughing fit subsided as if it had never happened. Afterward, the paper bag guy suddenly scowled and jumped over the fence, leaving Ami alone. He was so embarrassed that a loud scream was heard from the other side of the fence, followed by a hush. He ran far enough away, bouncing with joy along the way, but he did come to his senses at some point. Leaning against a wall, he slid down to the sidewalk. His thoughts were buzzing in swarms, making it seem as if his brain had completely shut down from embarrassment. Raising the hand from which he had held the pie, he sighed at the weight of life and what he had done. Feeling despicable for running off without warning, the paper bag guy raised the paper bag above his head and took another bite of the potato pie, savoring the taste of the vegetables they had picked together. He cherished the flavor of Umi's home-cooked food, knowing how much effort she had put into making it. He could sense the affection and kindness she had infused into the pie as she cooked. Meanwhile, Umi was packing the tray back into the cloth, eyeing the tea bottle that she had sneakily slipped to the paper bag guy. Remembering how he had drank from it, Umi started to blush, reflecting on the situation. The paper bag guy's nervousness about the indirect kiss made her nervous too, recalling his expression. Picking up the bottle, she began to ponder what to do with it next. However, she decided it was better to focus on the positives, thinking about all of the effort the paper bag guy had put into creating a secluded Hawaiian picnic. Somehow, everything had been resolved, and Umi took it all in stride, so she decided to text him. He responded with thanks and praised her for the pie, noting that the combination of potatoes and bacon was perfect. Paper bag guy invited Asagi Umi for a walk, but this time their meeting took place in a bustling playground where children were happily playing. Dancing in a short kimono, he waved plates and an umbrella that he had brought with him. It turned out he had invited her for the same reason he always did, just to see her smile. For this purpose, he had been practicing for a long time, and today he wanted to showcase his acrobatics, which even impressed the professional who was looking for him. Placing a plate on a stick, he spun it so fast that it began to whirl around. At the same time, he balanced a ball on top of an open umbrella, controlling both objects simultaneously while maintaining his balance. Surprised by his skills, even Umi praised him for his efforts and the unexpected but delightful performance that touched her deeply. At the same time, it was almost endearing when the kids ran up to him. At first, they just watched him, but then they started trying to interfere with his concentration by aiming slingshots at his legs and other vulnerable parts. To these little troublemakers, he was just an old circus performer, and Umi had to admit that the paper bag guy was quite popular with the kids. Naturally, he wasn't too thrilled that someone was interrupting his dedicated Warakatsu performance for Umi, so he tried to playfully convey his wishes to them. However, they were too fearless, and while he swung his fists around, they clung calmly to his shoulders. In the end, the children prevailed, and the paper bag guy was left lying on the ground with his legs tied with a jump rope and a plastic bucket on his head. The umbrella was taken away from him, and a branch added to the scene completed the landscape of his humiliation. Unfortunately for the paper bag guy, he lost the playful battle with the kids, but Umi was happy to see him interacting with them, so she started clapping her hands and called his acrobatics amazing. She began to smile, but their fun was interrupted by the weather. First, a single raindrop fell on her hair, and then a real downpour began. The children on the playground instantly ran away, realizing that if they got sick, they wouldn't be able to play. Just like that, Umi was left alone with the paper bag guy. Seeing the umbrella lying on the ground, he picked it up and held it out to Umi, not even knowing if it was waterproof. There wasn't much of a choice, so he wanted to send her home with at least something. However, Umi was just as worried about him and didn't want to accept the umbrella, fearing that the paper bag guy would catch a cold. They tried to give each other the umbrella for a while, each stubbornly insisting that the other take it to stay dry. Their stubbornness dragged on until the raindrops began to make a deafening noise, so loud that they couldn't hear each other. That's when he came as close to her as possible and offered to walk her home with the umbrella, to which she finally agreed. They ended up having to run home for quite a long time, with the paper bag guy trying to protect Umi from the rain as much as possible, sacrificing himself in the process. By the time they reached their destination, the umbrella was soaked and broken. After all, a bamboo umbrella was only good against the sun. Trying to fold the broken umbrella as neatly as possible, Umi held it out, and only then noticed how soaked the paper bag guy was. He asked her to ignore his appearance, but it was hard to do because the soaked bag stuck to his face with every breath, making it difficult for him to breathe normally. Eventually, he was persuaded to remove the paper bag, but then he took his plates and covered his face with them, happy that they created the effect of big eyes. At the same time, Umi pointed towards the landing where the door to her apartment was. Naturally, she wasn't just calling him to follow her. She also promised to lend him a towel and an umbrella. She even offered him some clothes, though she warned that they might be too big for him. The last sentence embarrassed him so much that when they reached the corner, he banged his head against the railing as hard as he could, trying to rid himself of the embarrassing thoughts as quickly as possible. Umi was deeply concerned about the paper bag guy, assuming he had slipped, but he revealed that the heavy blow to his head was self-inflicted. With one hand hiding his face and the other untying the knot on the cloth, he straightened the hand towel completely, revealing an angry mask ornament on the front of it. True to form, he emphasized to himself that he looked strange, so he didn't want to go to her house. Despite his excuses, Umi realized that the paper bag guy was different from the stalker who had been following her around the school, and she was sure she wasn't in danger today. Moreover, she didn't want him to catch a cold, so she pulled the belt of his kimono up and drew him closer, expressing her concern directly to his face. At that moment, Umi furrowed her eyebrows and gave him a threatening look, demanding that he not argue and simply follow her. In response, the paper bag guy pulled the towel over his face hard, exposing his red cheeks. Still, he couldn't agree to the idea, explaining that he couldn't get sick that easily. However, Umi was just as stubborn, so the simple agreement of an exchange for an umbrella didn't satisfy her. After a moment of silence, the paper bag guy sadly reminded Umi that he was no different from that school stalker. He wondered what she was thinking when she interacted with him, and what other people would think when they saw him at her house. It was time to become more conscious. Of course, after such moral pressure, Umi was very confused, but a voice from the next door quickly brought her to her senses. Unfortunately, standing on the landing, everyone could hear her, so she abruptly switched to a whisper. Realizing that this could get her in trouble, paper bag guy, albeit under pressure, still entered her apartment. They did it just in time because after her door slammed shut, the curious neighbor immediately looked outside to check what was going on. Meanwhile, Umi's heart was pounding as she stood on the doorstep, trying to calm it down. Umi stood in silence, but as promised, she took off her shoes and went to get a towel. Before she could even take a step, however, the paper bag guy grabbed her arm and asked her to listen to the rest of the speech he wanted to say before doing so. Shifting the towel from his face to his head, he emphasized how important this was to him. Umi abruptly turned towards him as he tried to mumble something but only started stuttering. In the end, she just stared at him with surprised eyes when the paper bag guy finally admitted that he loved her. However, he himself realized that they were only friends, so it was fine for her to invite him over or borrow things. But for him, it was too hard to do. The paper bag guy had tried to convey that to her more than once, so he hoped she would understand this time. Plus, he was holding her hand himself and realized how hot it was getting, so he asked her to pay attention too. The paper bag guy had tried to tell Umi how he felt before, but he hoped she would finally understand this time. He held her hand tightly, feeling the warmth spreading through his own hand. He begged her to listen to him, feeling a sense of urgency in his words. Standing in Umi's room, surrounded by her things like the towel and clothes, he felt a deep connection to her. It was hard for him to express his feelings because he felt so embarrassed. Taking anything from her felt like a huge obstacle he couldn't overcome. Suddenly, he gently took Umi's hand and placed it over his chest, right where his heart was beating fast. Her palm felt the thudding rhythm of his heart, like a drum in his chest. Both of them blushed deeply, feeling overwhelmed by the intense moment. They wanted to escape the situation out of embarrassment. Despite feeling embarrassed, the paper bag guy felt he needed to talk to Ami. He explained that if he ever borrowed her clothes, it would be because he wanted to feel close to her, to be surrounded by her scent and find comfort in her presence. He felt the same sentiment about using her towel. It was like having a piece of her with him, something he treasured deeply. Suddenly, his emotions took over, and he found himself speaking louder than he intended. He tried hard to express how he felt, but eventually, he managed to calm down a bit. However, his passionate outburst left Ami feeling extremely embarrassed, making it hard for her to listen to him. From his perspective as a friend, the idea of using Umi's things in such a personal way seemed wrong and even gross. He couldn't imagine crossing that line and risking their friendship. The paper bag guy was careful not to upset Ami as he tried to express his feelings gently. When he finally let go of her hand, Ami stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do next. It took her a couple of minutes to collect her thoughts before she hurriedly ran to her room. As he expected, she had escaped, but luckily, the rain had stopped, so he could leave. With gratitude, he opened the door and stepped outside, saying a sincere thank you into the apartment. Just as he was about to leave, he heard his name called, and he froze on the landing. Ami came running from her room, surprising him. She poked him with a small towel, and he blinked in astonishment. He hadn't expected to see her again so soon. With his mouth hanging open in surprise, the paper bag guy instinctively caught the falling cloth. His eyes locked on Ami. Despite his earlier worries, Ami didn't find him gross or unpleasant. Feeling a rush of shame, she nervously ran her fingers through her hair, trying to find the right words. She wanted to tell him that borrowing her clothes or holding them wasn't as embarrassing as he thought. It was just a small thing for her. As Ami shut the door in front of the paper bag guy's puzzled face, he was left standing alone in the stairwell, utterly confused. He had wanted to explain to her why it was important not to act too quickly, but now it seemed like everything was back to how it was before. Thinking about Ami's words, he felt his legs give out, and he collapsed to the ground in embarrassment. Covering his flushed face with equally red hands, he couldn't believe what had just happened. He tried to muffle his embarrassment with a quiet scream, hoping not to attract the neighbors' attention. Meanwhile, Ami stood outside the door, tucking her hair behind her ear to hide her blushing cheeks. She felt completely confused about her feelings and couldn't understand anything. Ami felt out of sorts after the awkward encounter with the paper bag guy in her apartment. She couldn't shake off the memory, even while she was cooking. The situation kept replaying in her mind, making it hard for her to focus. Even the cabbage she was preparing couldn't distract her from her thoughts. The more she dwelled on it, the more embarrassed she felt. She questioned the nature of her relationship with the paper bag guy, unsure if he was just a friend or something more. All these thoughts swirled in her head, making her feel overwhelmed. It got to the point where steam seemed to be coming out of her ears from all the overthinking. Feeling uneasy from overthinking, Ami decided to check her temperature, just in case. She hoped she hadn't caught a fever, but the thermometer showed 37 degrees. Though it wasn't high, she still felt off. Deciding to take a break from her studies, she crawled into bed and covered herself with a warm blanket. Not used to overthinking, she set her worries aside for later. She texted her friends to let them know she wouldn't be at school. However, even as she scrolled through her phone, her thoughts about the paper bag guy persisted. Maybe it was because she still hadn't figured out her feelings for him, or maybe it was just the rain and nerves getting to her. Either way, she felt lost and uncertain. With a heavy sigh, Ami set her smartphone down beside her pillow and gazed up at the ceiling. The slight fever and the swirl of thoughts made her eyelids heavy, and soon she found herself slipping into a reverie from long ago, recalling a special friendship she once had. It was peculiar that Ami was only now recollecting memories of this kind boy, but his presence had left a lasting impression on her. She remembered a time when they were playing in the yard, and she had ended up in tears, pressing a handkerchief to his forehead, begging for forgiveness. If only she hadn't climbed that tree, she wouldn't have put him in harm's way when he tried to rescue her. Unfortunately, his act of heroism had resulted in blood trickling down his forehead, which she had desperately tried to stop. But like a true gentleman, he hadn't shed a tear, instead enduring the pain and asking her not to cry. In an effort to comfort her, he reached into his pocket to offer her something. However, when he pulled it out, they discovered that the lollipop ring had shattered into pieces, leaving only the base intact. Despite his disappointment, he was upset that his surprise had turned out to be a failure. Nevertheless, Mummy still accepted the candy and instructed him to open his mouth, which he obediently did. Opening the rustling wrapper, Mummy took a large chunk of the candy and held it out to him. Thanks to the broken ring, they could share this sweet treat together. As she continued to cry, she reassured him repeatedly that he wasn't uncool at all. Despite the pain from his wound, he blushed deeply and started crawling away, telling Mummy to stay put. Ignoring her pleas not to move, he rushed to the roadside where grass grew. He quickly found what he needed and hurried back to her, asking her to hold out the plastic part of the broken ring. Wrapping the base with a small branch, he transformed it into a much better and more beautiful ring. Though it still looked a bit childish, the boy promised to give her a real one next time. Holding his bleeding forehead, he knelt down and expressed his wish for a sage Ayame to always smile. Abruptly opening her eyes at the loud message tone, Ami finally woke up, feeling disoriented. Squirming on the bed, she reached for her phone and saw messages from her excited friends offering to come over and take care of her. As she replied to them, she noticed that she was sweating profusely, and she couldn't recall what exactly she had dreamed about. Despite feeling like it was an important memory, she couldn't seem to replay the dream no matter how hard she tried. Suddenly, a new message popped up, but Ami didn't suspect who it was from since all her friends were in the same group where she had already reassured them. Thinking it might be from the paper bag guy, worried about her condition, she opened it with anticipation. However, reality proved to be disappointing as it was just a scheduled email from a cooking magazine. Ami silently continued to stare at the screen, puzzled by why she kept thinking about the paper bag guy. Trying to make sense of her thoughts, she realized she hadn't told him about her fever, so expecting a message from him was foolish. The next moment, her smartphone beeped again, and she jumped up, rushing to unlock it. However, it was only a text from her mom, so she quickly replied and tiredly fell back into bed. Closing her eyes, Ami couldn't understand why she felt compelled to check her phone every time it beeped. Her thoughts were then interrupted by quiet rustling noises, which made her sit up again. Listening intently, she asked if anyone was there, but there was no response. Thinking it might be a delivery, she headed for the door, which she habitually locked with 2 locks. Opening the door ajar, she apologized for the wait and peered out onto the landing, still feeling groggy and uncertain. Though Ami was certain she heard footsteps, there was no one in sight. She chalked it up to the effects of her fever and returned to her apartment. But upon opening the door, she spotted a package that rustled, drawing her attention. Picking it up, she noticed an item inside that seemed eerily familiar. It was the same towel she had lent to the paper bag guy. Along with the towel, a wooden stick fell out, rolling towards the railing and creating a vibration that set off a chain reaction. The force caused perfectly placed dominoes to fall one by one. Ami peered out the door and watched as the last domino hit a small ball, which rolled down a slide and knocked over a dozen bowling pins. The sight reminded her of mini bowling, and she watched in amazement as the well-crafted trajectory of the ball also caught a toy mouse, which began to approach her. Suddenly, a string tied to the toy's tail triggered a small ball of confetti hanging from the ceiling above her. It unraveled to reveal a note, thanking her for the towel. Immersed in a sense of childhood wonder, Ami watched the spectacle with wide-open eyes, filled with childlike delight. As she looked at the towel, she couldn't help but clutch it to her chest, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. In her spare time, Ami had another encounter with the paper bag guy, who stood trembling at their meeting point, pleading with her not to do anything. Despite his pleas, she continued to point her sword at him, warning him to brace himself for further consequences. Ignoring his protests, she took a small run-up and thrust her weapon into a large, person-sized box, seemingly piercing through the paper bag guy standing inside it. However, to her surprise, the paper bag guy emerged from the box completely unharmed. It turned out the box was just a clever illusion, stacked with cardboard swords and sabers, which remained standing in the middle of the playground, showcasing the paper bag guy's skill at creating illusions. Ami couldn't help but applaud and praise him for his impressive performance. Taking one of the blades, she pressed down on its tip, which flexed quite a bit under slight force. However, This didn't diminish her admiration for his tricks and his skillfulness, even though he was using fake swords. Moving closer to the box, Umi examined it closely, assuming that the paper bag guy had crafted the fake swords by hand, spending a lot of time on such a detailed illusion. However, at that moment, she received a flick on the nose from the paper bag guy, who forbade her from getting too close to the magic box. He warned her that if she approached any further, all the magic would vanish. Despite his warning, Umi paid him no heed and stared at his palm as if entranced. Waving his hand in front of her face, the paper bag guy asked her what was wrong, snapping her out of her trance. However, her state of mind didn't last long, and she returned to staring at his hand, remarking that it was the first time she had noticed the size of it. Lowering her gaze to the box, she smiled and confessed that every time she spent talking to the paper bag guy or thinking about him, her heart started beating faster, and she felt a warm sensation in her chest. At that moment, the paper bag guy was so ecstatic that he seemed to be floating on cloud 9. Forgetting how to communicate properly, he began happily juggling his weapons, making incomprehensible sounds of joy. This was his way of letting off steam and feeling relieved. He wasn't sure if things would turn out well, but he was glad that Umi liked his performance. It reminded him of the times when he had asked Michiko to watch him practice, but she always seemed to slip away. Michiko was a moody person unlike the kind-hearted Umi, but he didn't even realize what had just happened to her. Suddenly, Umi felt a sensation she had never experienced before upon hearing the paper bag guy talk about another woman with joy. Her heart skipped a beat, and an unpleasant lump formed in her throat. The news that the paper bag guy was still talking to someone else left Umi feeling a thick layer of resentment settle in her heart. Flustered, the paper bag guy waved his hand in front of her again, trying to draw her attention. But Umi remained silent, lost in her thoughts. She quietly apologized for being distracted, and before she knew it, evening had descended, and the street lights came on, signaling everyone to disperse and head back home. Once she arrived home, Umi immediately sank onto her bed, hugging the teddy bear she had been given earlier. Only one thought circled in her mind, consuming her thoughts. She couldn't shake the image of another woman laughing with the paper bag guy, imagining that they were having a great time together. These thoughts made her grip the unfortunate toy tighter and tighter, as if trying to crush the bitterness in her heart. With her nose pressed against the teddy bear, Umi pondered more about who this Michiko was. Her head was filled with all sorts of thoughts, but she stubbornly dismissed the idea of worrying about him. If it truly bothered her, she could just ask him directly. But then, she wondered why she remained silent. At that moment, her phone buzzed again, signaling a new message and forcing her to let go of the teddy bear. Checking the sender, Umi blushed as she read the message from the paper bag guy, expressing his concern for her. He had noticed that she seemed a little different, and offered his help if she needed anything. Reading his sincere request, she felt grateful to have such a caring acquaintance, but she still couldn't bring herself to ask the question that was on her mind. Reading his message again, her eyes instantly became moist with a sense of despair. She searched for an answer to her question, realizing that it was all because she liked the paper bag guy taking care of her. Clutching her phone tightly, Umi pressed her forehead against the screen, trying to make sense of her feelings. The next day, paper bag guy stood at their usual meeting spot, anxiously awaiting Umi, who was the organizer this time. He was worried about her condition, but when she finally arrived, apologizing for being late, he reassured her that everything was fine and that he hadn't waited long at all. He was always ready to come to her aid, any time of the day. Nervously, Umi rubbed the handle of her bag, mustering up the courage to ask him about Michiko, the girl he had mentioned before. When she finally gathered her will, she asked him about her. Surprisingly, this question didn't embarrass the paper bag guy at all, and he was ready to show her a picture on his phone right then and there. However, Umi hesitated, not wanting to see it. To her dismay, he had already unlocked his phone and shoved the screen right in her face. It turned out to be a picture of the neighbor's cat that he played with periodically. Umi felt like her soul had left her body, unable to answer the guy's questions. Confused, the paper bag guy didn't understand what was wrong, assuming that she wanted the photo and promising to send her a message. Naturally, Umi hadn't anticipated the situation taking such a turn. Blushing at her own thoughts, she squatted down and covered her face. The paper bag guy immediately started running around in different directions, seeking help, worried that she had fallen ill. However, it turned out to be much simpler than that. Umi explained to the paper bag guy that she had simply misunderstood, thinking Michiko was another woman. He quickly clarified that it was impossible, as women usually give him those slight stares and he doesn't even get to talk to them. Feeling extremely embarrassed, Umi continued to cover her face, realizing it was her own fault for misunderstanding. Thinking about the fun times she had with the paper bag guy, Umi couldn't shake off the feeling of jealousy towards the thought of another woman. She had never felt so ashamed before. Her admission made the paper bag guy freeze in place, his hand outstretched, as silence enveloped them, drowning them in their own thoughts. Despite his disbelief, the paper bag guy asked again if what Umi said was true, and she affirmed it. However, he couldn't calm down and continued to ask a few more times. Seeing her embarrassment, Umi finally told him not to ask about it again. Turning away, she noticed that she didn't look flushed at all. The paper bag guy sat beside her, covering his eyes with his hands and apologized, averting his gaze. Hearing her words made him happier than ever. He reassured her not to worry about such trivial matters and promised to always be there for her, making her smile no matter what happened in her life. Umi couldn't help but smile back at him, genuinely touched by his affectionate words, and thanked him in return.